Hey y'all, if you're just popping in, if you're coming over from the last one, welcome in. Today we are going to discuss a little bit of a different story. If you are not familiar with Joseph Edward Duncan, Edward Duncan is actually deceased at this moment in time, but he died on death row after murdering multiple victims. We're going to get into it, talk about it. It's a really hard one. There's a lot of sad stuff throughout the story. There's a lot of things that could have been prevented in the story, but we're going to dive in and talk about it a little bit. He's got one lone survivor still to this day, but buckle up. It's going to be hard to listen to.
You're beautiful but unsatisfied since day one. You were getting teased and it scarred you when you were young. Now you're getting older and you've been on the grind. Your paper off the scale so you feel like it's time. So you got a nose job, that's the primary thing. People teased you as a kid and for some reason you hit. Always into high fashion, girl, you heavy like lead. Liposuction out your shell like a chicken and egg. Feeling confident but now you're becoming obsessed. First your nose, then your weight, now your butt and your breast. It's a vanity fair, cosmetic overdose. Fiending for a next operation like it was dope. Now you feel the need to skin pill, your skin's no good. But if those around you were real, they'll tell you the truth. Just because you spending thousands, that don't make it alright. Had one problem, now it's many going under the knife. Your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, looking your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. I said your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, looking your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. Come on. Vanity Fair, yeah. Changing one or two things cool, girl, do you? Do you wanna be beautiful and look like you? Or do you wanna look like someone you saw in a magazine or video, but not in the raw? I like nice shaped bodies, bikinis Brazilian, but too much of anything just isn't appealing. Some people spend a lifetime, even a million. No grace like those unhappy when chilling. A girl with a big butt, big lips, small hips is what we all love to see, and men dream about this. There is nothing wrong with getting something broken fixed. Some women get a breast job cause cancer assists. Some women want to please their man and insist. And a woman really loves you if she wants to do this. But abuse ain't the same as intention with care. So be careful of the drug called the Vanity Fair. Vanity Fair. Your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, looking your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. I said your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, looking your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. Your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, looking your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. I said your lips, breasts, butt, legs, waist, hips, nose and chest, waistline, face lines, look at your best. Do it like the rest, Vanity Fair. Come on.
Hey y'all, give me one second. I had to step downstairs for a minute. Running back and forth. Give me a second. I'll be right there with you guys. Gotta walk back up my stairs. All right, let's go. So how many of you, I'm going to ask this before I say hello, and then I'll catch up with the comments. How many of you have heard of Shasta Groney, Joseph Edward Duncan, or the Wolf Lodge murders in Idaho? This case is 18 years old, almost. The 18th anniversary is coming up. Anybody heard of it? Put a 1 if you've heard of it. Put a 2 if you haven't. Hey, Jennifer. Hey, Kara. Was that justice? Hold on just a moment. Look at all the new members. Y'all are great. Thank you guys all for becoming members. Was that justice? Laura, LG. Yeah, I was gone for 5 seconds. Sweet Pea, Molly's Moose Knuckle. Beck, not for nothing. Connie, Laura, I hope you're doing good. Liz, Cherish, Full Gamer, Running Bear, Queen Bella, Miss Lee, Lisa, Self-Proclaimed Detective, Angelisa, Crockpot. What are you making? Making for dinner. Yopra Gal, got your coffee in hand. Little Dove, Mama Cat. I love the intro. Oh, thank you so much. Go find me. I appreciate it. Ah, thank you, Wings of Faith. You guys are too kind to me. Dumpy Dump, Safari, Little Dove. Everybody Quartz, Sarah, Chopper Lily, Ellen, Baroness. Thank you for becoming a member. Okay, I got to play the song. Just a minute. I Hate Peas, Tammy. Oh, you guys, thank you guys so much. Brenda, Ellen. Okay, Millie, SN Park. Oh, I'm glad. Okay, Starry Night. It's me, Heather. Blank screen. Let me make sure I didn't miss anybody here. Krug's wifey. Kiki's got his cord. Tina, Yinzi. Oh my gosh, Yinzi, me and you have talked about this before. T in chats, like when we've been sitting here talking about it. Okay, this is a bad one. Amanda. Okay, so what we're going to do today to get everybody kind of familiar with it is we're going to actually watch somebody else's content. I know I'm not a big fan of that. Oh, why is that off? I just put my hair up in a ponytail too because it's driving me nuts. Anyways, we're going to talk about and we're going to watch somebody else's content because I have lived through this case. Like I lived similar area. This was everywhere when I was growing up. Kenzie was 3 at the time of this story. I lived very close by of where one of the victims was found, but we're going to get into that. But I want you guys, we're going to walk back and I'm going to take you guys through a couple podcasts that give you the layout of what happened here. So then we can move on into just cleaning today. No idea what's for dinner. And cream cheese chili. Oh, that sounds good. I got out. What did I get out for dinner? Oh, I got chicken breasts out. Oh, I left them downstairs. I need to move them to the sink. I'll call Kenzie. I just said chicken. I'm making chicken pasta, I think, though. Yes, this is a closed. Yeah, everything's done on this one. This is not an active case. This has been solved. In fact, after this case was solved, there was other ones that came forward. He had previous victims to this, and he was charged with those crimes. He got the death penalty. It's been all completely done. So we're going to get into it. We're going to talk about it. We're going to go through this. Hey, Solo. Yes, I know. I need a break too. I need a definite break. I know you guys do, and I did too. I am glad you guys are here for a pivot because we all need it. Again, thank you guys all for joining the membership. Welcome to the jungle. We got fun and games. All right, let me grab the one we're going to start with here. So I'm going to start with, where to go? Sorry, give me 1 second. I have so many videos saved. So this is it. So I'm actually going to start with a podcast. And the reason I'm doing it is because I want you guys to understand this is not my content, but I want you guys to have a baseline of where this story will go. We might skip around a little bit. Again, multiple victims, but it overlaps multiple states. It's a mess, but we're going to start here. And then I think this is the one. I'm positive this is the one. Okay. Buckle up. I will pause a lot. Again, this is all based on fair use. This is a story that's 18 years old. Joseph Edward Duncan is deceased. He died of medical issues on death row. Okay. Let's go. Do you guys want it full screen? Or do you guys like when I sit on the side of it? You guys tell me. If you want me to sit on it, sit on the screen, I will. Yeah, yes. Safari. Well, not only that, I can't mentally do it. She does the same thing every day, and it just gets more disgusting because she wants more views, and it's a spin. So let's do something horrifying, but in a different way.
From about 15 years on up, a great deal of my thoughts were basically unshareable.
We are all eager in some form or another. Yes, I am you. Not 100%, but I am you.
My mother was a sick, angry, hungry, and very sad woman. I hated her, but I wanted to love my mother.
This is Serial Killing, a podcast.
The podcast is Serial Killing, a podcast. This is the name of this podcast. In fact, I had never heard of them before I was starting to do research, and I really was. It's hard to hear. It'll pick up a little bit. If it continues to be hard to hear, I'll switch it to another one. There's a lot of people that have already covered this in depthly. This is just one I really connected with because it gives the background of Joseph Edward Duncan. And I want you to have that a little bit before I just jump you right into the case in Idaho, because it's a lot. So I want you to have a baseline before we get that far. You can't hear it still? Okay. If it doesn't get louder, I'll mess around with it.
Hey, Murder Fam, and welcome back to Serial Killing, a podcast. My name is Alyssa Carroll, and this is Serial Saturday, where every Saturday we go through the life stories of serial killers to see if we might catch a glimpse of why they displayed their famous, vile, and disturbing behaviors. This week's podcast will be on Joseph Duncan III. This one, of course, comes with a huge disclaimer, because this involves children. And
in fact, I need to put that up right now too. I should add that to this. This is a major trigger warning. 3 of his victims were children. Actually more than that. So 3 of the victims in the Idaho case were children. There was 2 sisters and then another boy too. So there is a lot of child victims. There was one lone survivor. Her name is Shasta Groney. She actually lives in Idaho still to this day. But yes, very big trigger warning. If this type of stuff does bother you, please exit now.
And horrible things that happen to children. So if you're sensitive to that, it's okay if you don't want to listen. We'll still be friends. Joseph Edward Duncan III was born on February 25th, 1963 in Tacoma, Washington. So let's get into some history for that time. This year, U.S. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in his car in front of his wife while being driven through Dallas, Texas. Lee Harvey Oswald was pointed to as the, quote, lone gunman, which most people now do not agree with. Lyndon Johnson took over the presidency. Hurricane Flora devastated the Caribbean, hitting Trinidad, Tobago, and Grenada. For a time, it had winds in excess of 170 miles per hour. The first woman in space, Soviet Union's Valentina Tereshkova.
She's just giving you guys background on the happenings when he was born, kind of laying out everything. I know it's a little different, but her style is a little bit different. Every podcaster has a little bit of a different style. I just love how she lays everything out on the table so everybody knows where the context is, where she's headed. I really like it. I don't know. This is just me.
Tereshkova was launched in the Vostok 6 spacecraft. She was in space for 3 days. She then landed safely back on Earth. Yugoslavia became the Socialist Federal Republic of Yugoslavia, and its leader, Josip Broz Tito, was named, quote, president for life. In Libya, an earthquake destroyed the village of Bars, killing around 500 people. So this was the atmosphere that Joseph was born into. Joseph was the second youngest out of 5 children to Joseph E. Duncan Jr. and Lillian, but I couldn't find her maiden name. Joseph's father was career military and was often deployed, leaving Lillian alone with 5 children. The family.
That's a big piece right there to remember too. He came from a military family. He was one of 5 children, seemingly normal upbringing on the outside. On the outside, that's always kind of, we always look at the family life after all of this stuff. And here we are, hearing So far, pretty typical.
Family also moved every year or two, according to Joseph's brother Bruce. He stated the children went to school, they went to church, and they were members of the Boy Scouts, all very normal. Now, Bruce also says that there was no abuse during their childhood. Their sister Sherry says otherwise. She later told the judge during Joseph's trial that all of the children were frequently beaten by Lillian and that Lillian often complained about men being worthless, quote unquote. She says their mother attended church obsessively. She said that if any of the children cried out or fought back during the beatings, well, the beatings intensified.
What story does this remind you of so far? Can you think of and name like any other of the prolific serial killers that have been talked about? How many of those same situations does this seem familiar with? I know a lot of them have talked about the extensive abuse in their homes, so on and so forth. Some of the children admitted to it. It seems like it's very, very, very similar that you find out these things after the cases.
Joseph, she says, would sort of take the beatings and then go to his room to be with himself and cry. So, as far as information about his earlier childhood, that's all I could find, which is surprising considering his crimes. Nonetheless, Joseph's parents divorced when he was 15 years old, and he, soon after, would be in trouble with the law. He took a gun, he pointed it at a 9-year-old little boy, and raped him. Some sources say he was arrested, but then released. I can't confirm that with any degree of confidence, but the next year he was arrested for driving a stolen vehicle. He rants in a blog of sorts that he couldn't understand why he was charged with also a deadly weapon because the cop was in his way when he was speeding down the road.
Think about how many people this sounds like. Like, that's what I just sit here and think, like, how many of these serial killers or, they all have had previous run-ins with cops, very, very, seemingly normal lives until there's certain things that start picking out that people can see.
From that offense, he was sent to Dislin's Boys Ranch in Tacoma. Now, there's a place with some history. This boys' ranch was a state-run home for boys. It is reported that during the 80s and 90s, boys were being sexually abused. Dozens of men who were sent there in their youth now say that they were sexually abused, beaten with socks that had batteries in them, and the ranch staff was well aware of what was going on. In fact, supposedly they were told that they were just going to have to take care of themselves, that, quote, "This is the law of the jungle at the boys' ranch," unquote.
That the boys' ranch stuff, I'm sorry to say this, but the boys' ranch stuff, there is something with some of those camps. Like, and I call them camps very specifically because some of them are definitely more, they're terrible. They're absolutely terrible. There's a lot of abuse that happens in a lot of them. They don't have the best oversight. There's a lot of things that go brushed under the rugs. There's been a lot of abuse. You've heard a lot about the ones in Utah with the celebrities that have been to them, such as Kat Von D, so on and so forth. That's right down the road for me. But they happen all over these boys' ranches. They leave an abusive situation with their families only to be sent away to another abusive situation. And they're stuck. Like, again, not justifying any of the end results, but these are very important details.
Joseph was sent there in 1980. Now, I mentioned the blog before. Joseph later wrote a blog about his experience there. So here's a direct quote. It's kind of a long one. Quote, "It seemed the boy in the cell next door was jumping up and down on his bunk, which was bolted to my bunk through the wall. So I stood on my bunk and looked through a crack between the cells where the wall met the windows, and I could see him bouncing in the window. I asked him what he was doing, and he told me he was putting on a show for the girls in the dorm across the courtyard out the window. When I looked, I saw several girls crowded in one of the large dorm room windows in the wing across the way. They were taking turns lifting their shirts and exposing their breasts. The boy next to me was exposing an erection in return. I don't remember if I exposed myself as well, but I probably did. It would have been a natural thing to do. So I don't recall if I could actually see the boy next to me through the crack exposing himself to the girls. The whole experience was brand new for me and strangely liberating. I did not know such behavior could be accepted among kids, and of course, it thrilled me.
He got excitement out of, the whole new, he never knew. Like, it was liberating. I found that to be very, very telling. He felt liberated by this.
I do remember clearly that even though I was in very intimate proximity for extended periods with a lot of younger boys, I had no sexual desires or interests in them. This is significant because less than a year later, I raped a boy 2 years younger than me, and in treatment for that rape, I was convicted, brainwashed, literally, into believing that my sexual deviancy was long lived. The treatment program ignored the significance of my non sexual proclivities while I was at the boys' ranch and instead focused on the much earlier incidents of childhood sexual curiosity as evidence of my prolonged deviance. There was one incident that occurred while I was at Dislan's that had a major impact on my sexual behavior after I went back home to live with my mother. The mitigation investigators uncovered numerous criminal and civil laws against such ranch staff for abuses that occurred there for many years, around the time I was there. My lawyers tried to get me to admit to any abuse I suffered while I was there, but I honestly never witnessed or even suspected such abuse. But then, I was still very naive back then, so I would have had no reason to suspect anything, even if I did see something suspicious. This became a kind of touchstone memory for me that helped me to come to understand many years later how the system brainwashed me into believing I was sick, dangerous, and deviant, when the truth was I was only confused by the many mixed signals I got from our very confused social system and culture, which I
That seems a little bit of not so much accountability, but it's very interesting how he's pointing out that he didn't notice anything. It was the brainwashing later that he figured out. Yeah, it became normal to him. Like, he felt that was just everyday life.
I have since come to refer to as the insanity that infected me.
Yes,
So
agreed.
later, Joseph did speak about a man who sexually abused him during that time, though he insists that he didn't feel abused, but rather enjoyed it.
That's the hard part right there, is because this is why I wanted to lay this out, because as the stories go on, he did not feel that that was abuse. He enjoyed it almost because it became so normal to him. If you're catching the same things that I am,
So he was released after a summer at the boys' ranch back into the custody of his mother. He states in the blog that the rest of his siblings were either grown and gone or had left to go live with their father, which left him alone with his mother. He went back to high school, but he had to start his sophomore year all over again. He spoke about how he had a newly learned immunity from consequence, quote unquote. Wrap your mind around that. A newly learned immunity from consequence. He then bragged about sexually abusing several young boys out in the woods after threatening them with an axe and molesting children that he was left with to babysit. including one that was still in diapers.
Trigger warning. Again, y'all, trigger warning. This is a really, really, really hard case to talk about. It's going to get worse than this. I know that's bad enough, but it gets way, way worse. It's brutal. And yeah, just buckle up, y'all. This is the exactly mellow one. This is the early life of Joseph Edward Duncan, who I don't know exactly if some people have named him, other people haven't. So I just tend to use his name, but he was responsible for most people know him for the Wolf Lodge murders outside of Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. It's terrible. Thank you so much for that, by the way. Thank you. At this point, how old is he at this point? T, hold on, let me. Amethyst. Some people claim that yes, 100%, and others don't. That is a piece that will come up during this. And let her finish. I think she says.
He described these actions like this, quote, "I only thought things like, what can I do next? Or that wasn't any fun. As for feelings, I wasn't scared or nervous, nor was I very excited or anxious. I just felt normal, like this was all just an encounter with a new friend or something. I had no concern at all for any consequences other than the embarrassment I might feel if I got found out. In my mind at that time, stealing cars and running from the police was far worse than what I was doing to that 14-year-old boy. As an adult, some 30 years later, this boy testified at my sentencing trial that this was by far the most painful and terrifying experience of his life. At the time, I thought I was being nice to him and maybe even teaching him fun things."
He seriously twisted it in his head. He was under 18 at this point. When he was at the boys ranch, he was under 18. Amethyst, there's a lot of questions in this story, even after 18 years. This is an 18-year-old case. Closed case. No. It's a tiny little place. Oh, you guys are going to learn so much. Hold on. Let me get through this. You guys are going to be mind blown here shortly.
Even now, I can't help but wonder what sort of sheltered life he must have had if this was the worst thing that ever happened to him. Unquote. So guys, I don't really have much stomach for describing exactly in detail what he did to this little boy, but he was promptly arrested. Joseph told a therapist that he figured he had raped around 13 younger boys at this point. He was 17 years old.
13 by 17. Think about that. 13 boys he had harmed by the time he was 17. And told a therapist this.
He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So, that was Joseph's childhood. Again, we don't have much about his early childhood. We also have conflicting stories between his interviewed brother and sister. His brother states that they had a fairly typical upbringing, while his sister says that they suffered abuse from an overly religious mother who spoke poorly about men. So which was it? Joseph himself says he suffered horrible abuse as a child, but there just isn't enough information, that I could find at least, to give me enough background to really say this or that was a catalyst or the spark, if you will. What we do know is that, from a fairly early age, he was a sexual predator. Now, juveniles account for about 36% of the population that commit sex offenses against minors. Those that do commit these crimes against other children are more likely than adult sex offenders to offend in groups and at schools and to have more male victims and younger victims. Also, the number of youth coming to the attention of the police for sex offenses increases sharply at age 12, according to the U.S. Department of Justice, and then plateaus at the age of 14.
The stats could be off at this point in time that she's saying, because this is an older video, just so you guys are aware. They could have changed some. They're still staggering.
Early adolescence is the peak age for offenses against younger children. Offenses against teenagers surge during the mid to late adolescence, while offenses against victims under 12 decline. Juvenile sex offender treatment programs saw a 40-fold increase between 1982 and 1992. Teenage sex offenders are predominantly male, more than 90%. Most offenses described in the clinical literature involve teenage offenders acting alone with young children as victims. We definitely see that with Joseph. Now, not all juvenile sex offenders grow up to be adult sex offenders. Current studies emphasize the diversity of juvenile sex offenders, their favorable prognosis suggested by low reoffending rates, and the commonalities between juvenile sex offending and other juvenile delinquency. And that's the part to pay attention to, guys. The commonalities between juvenile sex offending and other juvenile delinquency. So there was this study out of Florida State University titled, quote, "Differentiating two types of juvenile sex offenders, generalists versus specialists." The purpose of the study was to look at behaviors or factors that could be used to possibly predict and separate two types of juvenile sexual offenders. One is juvenile sex offenders with a history of antisocial behavior, which they called generalists, and the other was juvenile sex offenders without that history, which they called specialists. They also factor in other contributing things such as, parental abuse, household income, single parents, children of divorce, male versus female victim, victimization history, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, and then, of course, controlling for things like a history of ADHD, which is a whole other thing that we can get into some other time. So to summarize an over 100-page report, it showed that the children who committed sex offenses against other children showed an increased history of juvenile delinquency, but really that's to be expected. And while youths who commit sex offenses are highly unlikely to commit another sexual offense after the age of 14, those who show delinquent behavior on top of committing sexual offenses are more likely to reoffend later.
He had 13 victims by the time he was 17. He told a therapist that. He was sentenced to 20 years. That's it. 13 victims before he was 17. And he had more after that.
And again, this really isn't surprising. So in Joseph's blog posts, he seemed legitimately surprised at the negative reactions his victim had regarding his behavior. While he believed his behavior should have been dismissed as nearly normal, it would have been quite dangerous to ignore his aggressive sexual behavior. After his arrest and sentencing to 20 years, he was diagnosed as having antisocial personality disorder and a sexual psychopath.
Okay, right there. Keep that in mind as we go through this, because this is just a tip of the iceberg. Like, this is a tiny little section of the iceberg. Remember those: antisocial personality disorder and sexual psychopath.
So what does that look like? We know with a psychopath, there is the absence of emotional connection and true empathetic feeling. They just aren't capable of trusting and depending on other individuals. Their experience with sex is vastly different from their non-psychopathic peers, according to Psychology Today. The antisocial aspect is characterized by hostility, extroversion, self-confidence, impulsivity, aggression, and mild to moderate anxiety. And sex is never a mutually emotional experience with a psychopath. I mean, we all know this. They are singularly focused on getting the most important part out of it, which is their immediate needs.
That's why I started with this one. Sorry, I muted myself. Kenzie had called. This is why I started with this one. I wanted to lay the groundwork of this because I want you to understand that he had already been charged. They already knew. He already had victims. The chance of rehabilitation at this point in time was not really looking good at all. Like it shouldn't have been even a chance. Am I good now, Amethyst? Am I good? I think I'm good now. But this is a lot going into it. Just wait.
Regardless of the expense of others. They are sexually motivated by power, which is exactly how Joseph described his juvenile offenses. So let's get back into his story. Out of the 20-year sentence, he only served 14 of those years. He said those
14 of 20. He served 14 years in prison of the 20.
Years were filled with extreme violence, perversion, isolation, stress, and rape, and so on. But he said he was thankful for it. In 19
A wide variety of ages, heels on the ground. His youngest victim, I think, was 8, 9. I don't know if that was the youngest. I can't remember how old Anthony. For sure, he all the way through children to adults.
1994, once he was released, it was.
I can't remember exactly. There's one in. Give me a minute. I can tell you. I just have to look at my note.
Reported that he lived in several different areas around Seattle, Washington. He was arrested 2 years later for possession of marijuana. He was released on parole a few weeks later with new, quote, new restrictions. Now, there were 3 murders that occurred while he was on parole.
Okay, so his youngest victim that he murdered was 9, I think, from what I have here. There's one that's I don't know as much about, but we're going to get into it throughout this. But he also had victims that were babies that he had admitted to raping. So he didn't murder those children, but he had admitted to raping children that were in diapers. 13 victims by the time he was 17. It's horrific. Kenzie's going to sit with you guys for a minute. I got to run. Yeah. Heels, they let him out. He only served 14 years of his 20-year sentence, and he had 13 victims already by that point in time.
The first was 11-year-old Sammy Jo White and her 9-year-old sister Carmen Cubias, I hope I pronounced that correctly, who disappeared after leaving a motel in Seattle just before 11 p.m. They were leaving to go pick up some cigarettes from a restaurant that had one of those kind of old cigarette machines for their older brother. At that time, Joseph was living in another motel only 3 blocks away. Although the details of the murders are sparse, it is known that they died violently. Both of their skulls had been crushed. Their remains were not found until 2 years later in an abandoned barn, and it was determined that the girls were most likely killed as soon as they disappeared. Joseph confessed to murdering the girls and provided information that only the murderer would have known, but he confessed to this later. We'll get to it. Then in 1997, it is believed that he kidnapped, at knife point, 10-year-old Anthony Martinez while he was playing outside of his Beaumont, California home.
Thank you.
2 weeks later, his very badly sun-cooked, decomposed, naked body was found in a desert ravine. He had been bound around his wrists and ankles with duct tape, and he had been half covered in rocks. Unfortunately, or fortunately,
You'll know, well, you notice she said duct tape. Just hold on to that because that was one of his signature things is duct tape. Duct tape was always something for this. Ugh.
It was the circling vultures that caught the attention of a ranger near the spot. A news article about the horrific find stated that the authorities believed the crime was the work of a practiced sexual predator, unquote. The description from young witnesses who had also been out playing described Joseph completely. He later confessed to killing a young boy in the same fashion from that area later, but all three of the murders did go cold for a while. After this, Joseph traveled to Kansas, where he was arrested there for violating the terms of his probation and was not released again until July 2000, 3 years later. Joseph then decided to move to North Dakota. After that, he moved to Minnesota, where in 2004 he, quote, groped the genitals of a 6-year-old and a 7-year-old boy, unquote. He was arrested in March 2005, and in April, his bail was set at $15,000.
Okay, those dates right there are significant because the murders in Wolf Lodge, which is Idaho, which is the main piece of the story that kind of unraveled everything, they happened May 16th of 2005. May 16th. So all of this had happened previous to. He got out. And the next family he kills, May 16th, 2005, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. 3 in the house. He took 2 children out of the house. He had murdered 3 of them in the home that night, which we'll get into in depth. And then he kidnapped the 2 youngest, who were 8 and 9 at the time, Shasta and Dylan. Shasta was the youngest. Shasta survived. That's how this all unfolded. But you also hear them talking about younger children that he was still harming. Joseph Edward Duncan III.
Now, a Fargo businessman that Joseph had befriended posted his bail. Joseph said thanks by skipping bail and disappearing.
People that were interviewed that were around this man thought this man was the same as Brian Koberger, for instance. They thought he was highly educated. He was extremely normal. He was likable. He was going to, everybody thought, no way. Like, people that knew him had absolutely no clue, is what they say after the fact.
So a federal warrant was issued for his arrest. It was at this point that he made his way to Idaho in a stolen red Jeep Cherokee that he had picked up in Missouri and ended up in Coeur d'Alene. Now, Coeur d'Alene is in Idaho. Most of the story...
Coeur d'Alene is, in fact, the town that 2 of the girls from the Idaho 4 case, 2 of them are from Coeur d'Alene. Well, one of them was from Coeur d'Alene, Rathdrum, and Post Falls. That's that same area. So Coeur d'Alene is where Lake Coeur d'Alene is. It's a huge touristy area, and right outside off of I-90, the interstate runs through all the way to Seattle, Montana, so on and so forth. But I-90 runs outside of the lake. When you are headed east, there is a place off to the side called the Wolf Lodge. It is just looks like a rundown log cabin, but it's an amazing steakhouse. So that is Wolf Lodge. That is where he took off to, was Coeur d'Alene. And this is where we pick up soon.
Story about what happened is from the testimony of an 8-year-old girl named Shasta. So here's what she said. Shasta...
You're going to hear more about this in the upcoming videos that break this down, but this is the groundwork of what he had already done by the time he got to Idaho. So this will be a repeated part of this that you hear, but...
said that her mother called her to come into the living room as the girl had been in her room sleeping. There, she saw Joseph wearing black gloves and pointing a gun at her mother, 40-year-old Brenda. Joseph then tied Brenda's hands together with zip ties. Young Shasta said she then watched as Joseph did the same to her stepfather, 37-year-old Mark, and her 13-year-old brother, Slade. He then took her and her next older brother, 9-year-old Dylan, outside to the stolen Jeep, and they were told to wait. Joseph then went back into the house, and Shasta heard her stepfather...
Trigger warning. Just a trigger warning.
Scream, and watched as her gravely injured brother stumbled out of the house. Joseph ultimately bludgeoned the parents and the older brother to death.
The framing.
Shasta said that she and Dylan didn't actually see Joseph murder their family. Then she said Joseph got into the vehicle and began driving a very long way, at least from her perspective. I don't know how long it took for the family to be discovered murdered and the youngest two missing, but on May 16th,
It was less than 24 hours. The neighbor actually went over to pay Slade. So what happened, how this was found out to begin with, was the neighbor, Mr. Hollingsworth, went over. Slade went over to his house and did some yard work for him. So Mr. Hollingsworth was going over to pay Slade, the 13-year-old, for the yard work. When he got to the house, the back door was a little bit of ajar, and he was like, something's not making sense here. And then he saw blood. He called 911, and that's where it was found. And once they did the investigation, they found out that it was within 24 hours of them finding the bodies, thankfully. But still, it was a lot.
2005, police found the family's bodies in their home.
Early morning
An Amber Alert was issued for Shasta and Dylan, and the search for the children began. The autopsies on the three bodies determined the cause of death to be blunt force trauma to the head. So Joseph drove to a remote area of Montana and put together a couple of different campsites. He then bragged to the children that he...
Okay, we're going to stop her here because she doesn't give a lot of detail on some of this, and I want to go into the actual crime. Hold on just a second. Let me switch them out. Share this tab instead. Now, this is called This is Monsters. And this is from 4 months ago that they redid this one. Again, This is Monsters is the channel that this is on. And I'm not going to play the whole thing either. This, again, falls under fair use. They did a really good job of highlighting some of this.
2005, Brenda Groen's neighbor walked into her typical suburban house hoping to find her son. They owed him some money for helping out around their house, and they wanted to get it to him as soon as possible. This neighbor often went to visit the family and knew that he was always welcome in their home. But this time, no one answered his knock, and the house appeared to be much darker inside than usual.
Wolf Lodge, the area that they're talking about, is pretty remote. So yes, Coeur d'Alene is right there, but this is outside of town. There's very few neighbors. Everybody does know everybody out there. Most of them grew up around there. Mark and Brenda, the two adult victims in this story, actually, Brenda had been previously married to Steve Groney. They got divorced. Steve kept the oldest two children. Steve was actually living with Brenda's mom at the time of this, with their oldest two children, trying to get back on his feet. The youngest three were living with Brenda and Mark in the home right next to Wolf Lodge. They all knew each other. They'd pretty much grown up together. Steve was actually considered a suspect for quite some time. I don't know if they go into that, but I will talk about that.
The family of 5 was almost always up and about. The neighbor also noticed that all of their cars were in the driveway and each of them had open doors. Due to the suspicious circumstances, the neighbor called the police for a welfare check. When police arrived at the house, they entered the home and saw a truly horrifying scene. Some of the family were dead and others were missing. But what had happened in the house that night and who had done it?
They didn't even know at the first, though. They didn't have a clue that the kids were actually missing at the beginning. So they went into the home. They saw that there was 3 deceased individuals, which was Mark McKenzie, the boyfriend of Brenda Groney, Brenda, and her son, Slade, the 13-year-old, were all deceased in the home. At first, they didn't even know that the children were missing. They thought maybe they had ran out during the crime and were in the woods surrounding. They searched and searched and searched over 400 acres in that area because it is pretty remote and vast. So they searched for days on end. Finally, they issued an Amber Alert for the children, and the manhunt went from there. Like, they didn't have a clue what they were looking at, though.
This is Monsters. Joseph Edward Duncan was born on February 25, 1963 in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. He was the 4th of 5 children. His parents were Joseph Edward Duncan and Lillian Duncan. Joseph had a busy family, and he often felt like having so many older sisters took away the attention he really wanted from his parents. He had 3 older sisters and 1 younger brother, but he didn't grow up in a typical American setting. While most kids are born and raised in one neighborhood with the chance to make friends with other kids they'll know for the rest of their lives, Joseph didn't have this opportunity. His father, Joseph Sr., was in the Army, and because of his job, the family changed locations almost every year.
Which we already know because we just watched that. Hold on. Now I'm going to get to this part. We already heard the background. This is where we're going to pick up on this one.
Given up on making new friends and spent most of his time occupying himself in or around wherever he was living at the time.
This is the home that the incident happened. This is how remote it is. You can see on your screen. Let me pull it full screen for you guys. You can see very, very remote location. There's nobody else around. I will bring up better maps so you guys can see more of it as we go. But this absolutely beautiful area. But this is why it took them forever. They thought maybe the kids had just taken off and ran away from the home, and hopefully they would be found soon. That's what they initially were hoping. Well, that wasn't the case.
His lack of socialization would begin to show consequences later in his teenage years. Joseph's mother, Lillian,
we already heard about that,
and his antisocial tendencies worsened. Not long after, all 3 of his sisters,
yeah, we heard that part. Hold on. Let me get to the part where I care about.
Were in his small town. Joseph,
hold on,
as he could remember, able to continue with his crimes, and that by the time he would be released, he would be much more grown up and hopefully out of this stage of his life. The problem is that being a sexual predator is not a stage. It becomes an impulsion that most sexual predators are not capable of stopping. Joseph was paroled in 1994, only 14 years after his sentencing. This time, he left and was allowed to live in a halfway home to begin his reintegration into society. His only condition was that he not engage with any minors, since his past crimes were mostly involving young boys and he seemed to have pedophilic tendencies. He then moved on to live other places around the Seattle area, moving from place to place as he seemingly got bored of one area, stealing his girlfriend's car and traveling abroad while he was supposed to be staying in the Seattle area. He was arrested on August 27th at his stepsister's house in Kansas City and returned to prison. Once again, he was released less than a year later on July 14, 2000, for exhibiting good behavior while behind bars.
He was released again.
Off on a plan that must have been in the works for months. Joseph made a series of stops at stores to
hold on.
I'm falling in.
Let me go back. Sorry. I tried to timestamp this for myself and I totally
of Joseph's helped him post his $15,000 bail, releasing him from custody on April 5th. Joseph was set free while awaiting his trial to begin, and of course, his behavior was no different this time. Before posting bail, though, it seems as if Joseph had made some travel plans. He wasted no time falling into his old patterns, as soon as he was released, he took off on a plan that must have been in the works for months. Joseph made a series of stops at stores to acquire some equipment he had been meaning to get his hands on for a while. He started at a Walmart to buy both night vision goggles and a video camcorder. He then rented a red 2005 Jeep Grand Cherokee on April 15th and began his travels through the suburban parts of Missouri.
April 15th. April 15th. Within a month, he has more victims.
For a while, it seemed as if he was traveling without a specific plan in mind based on where he went. He moved throughout plenty of different towns and neighborhoods while on his voyage. But after license plates were reported stolen on April 27th from another resident, authorities realized that Joseph had no plans on returning the Jeep he had rented. The vehicle was reported stolen on May 24th, and authorities began attempting to track Joseph down to return the stolen car. On June 1st, a federal warrant was issued for his arrest when he refused to show up for court regarding the charges of the stolen car. With Joseph on the run with stolen plates and a stolen vehicle, investigators were looking for him but had no way of knowing where he had traveled. It had already been weeks since he had stolen the vehicle, and he could have been almost anywhere in the country. In reality, Joseph had taken Interstate 90 either through South Dakota or Wyoming and was heading west to Idaho. which investigators were not able to discover soon enough. There he stopped over in the Wolf Lodge area, which is about 8 miles west of Coeur d'Alene, a small city in northern Idaho. For unspecified reasons that investigators have never truly been able to find out. It could have been a planned trip, or he could have just decided as he was on his way, but somehow, while on this joyride, he wound up in a neighborhood where he found a family that he seemed to take a particular liking to.
It's not even a neighborhood. That's where people drive me nuts, because it's not a neighborhood. There is literally a little tiny log cabin that is an incredible steakhouse in the middle of nowhere. Like, you're driving out from Idaho, outside of Coeur d'Alene, you just drive on the interstate. There is a frontage road that runs along the interstate, but it is nothing really out there. There is Wolf Lodge and this one little house that they lived in. And there's a few others scattered around, but it's not a neighborhood like what you think of in most neighborhoods. There's not neighbors really close by. You saw how the house sits. He did have money. Yes, he did have money. He had been bailed out by one of his friends. Yeah. Yep. He had some money, obviously, to get there. This is going to get way worse.
Joseph had stumbled across the Groen family one day with kids playing.
It's actually called the Groney family. And this right here on your screen is Brenda Groney, who is the adult female victim. And that is Mark McKenzie, who was her live-in boyfriend. I don't think they were engaged yet. They had been together for quite some time. They grew up together, knew each other. Again, she had just recently been divorced, and she had the youngest 3 children living with her and Mark.
Playing outside and happy parents taking care of the family in the house. Something about them interested him, so he decided to stay a little bit longer instead of continuing on his trip across the country. The Groen family consisted of 40-year-old Brenda, her 37-year-old boyfriend, Mark McKenzie, and her 3 children, 13-year-old Slade, 9-year-old Dylan, and 8-year-old Shasta. All 5 of these family members.
There's another picture of the house and the location, so you can kind of get an idea of where this is. It's very secluded. You go out there to eat dinner. I love the Wolf Lodge. They've got amazing food, but it is not what people assume. It is so remote. It is not like there's this big, huge, anybody out there that doesn't belong definitely sticks out. They had a barbecue at their house the night before on May 15th and had friends over at the barbecue. It was pretty normal for them to have people over. Everything seemed like a normal night. They had barbecued, so on and so forth. Nothing big seemed to be going on.
Lived in a small suburban house nearby local woods that was surrounded by a quiet neighborhood. When Joseph came across them, he became intrigued with the family and decided to spend some time nearby. He would often take his car to go scope out the family during the day, driving around different parts of the neighborhood. He would return multiple times after becoming increasingly interested in Dylan and Shasta specifically. As we know, Joseph had a particular interest in young kids, and these 2 youngest members of the family are what convinced him to stick around. He would stay up at night and use his night vision goggles to watch the 2 children and the rest of the family in the dark inside their home. Joseph would stalk them for days before deciding what to do next. On May 15th, the family drove into the city to run some errands before returning home later that afternoon.
It's not a city either. Coeur d'Alene is a very small area. It's not a big metropolis. It's not a city. It's still a small area. It's a very big resort area. That is all pretty much Coeur d'Alene Resort, what you're seeing right there. All lakefront. It's booming in the summer, but there's really nothing else going on up there besides tourist stuff. It's grown some, but it's not. Yeah, it's beautiful up there, but it's just not a city.
They were supposed to go over to a friend's house to celebrate at a barbecue with some of their neighbors, but the barbecue ran late and it was already dark outside when the family returned home. Slade, the oldest child, had already mowed that neighbor's lawn earlier that day, and they owed him a little bit of money for helping them out. They didn't have cash on them that day, but they promised to meet him in the morning and pay him for mowing the lawn. Slade often helped the neighbors with small tasks like this around the neighborhood, and he was comfortable letting them pay him the following morning. Most of the neighbors were friends with the growing family, and they knew that their house was always a welcome place for them when they wanted to stop by. The next day, May 16, 2005, the neighbor returned to the Groen family home to hopefully find Slade and pay him. But when he knocked on the door, it appeared as if nobody was home, even at this time in the morning. The lights were off and there was no movement coming from inside the house, but he could hear the family dog barking. The neighbor thought it was strange, knowing as usually one of the 5 family members was up and about at almost all times of the day. All of the family's cars were still parked in the driveway, but the neighbor noticed that all of the doors were open just slightly. It seemed strange to think that they hadn't locked their cars since, although they lived in a safe neighborhood, it wasn't like the family to leave something unattended like this.
It wasn't normal for them to leave the door ajar, but one thing that people do not understand in this that has been misconstrued is the front door of their home was always unlocked. They didn't lock their doors. They grew up there. They knew Brenda has lived there her entire life. Like, they knew everybody around them. They had no idea that danger was lurking. They had neighbors that watched out for each other. It was just not that. The back door was ajar. Everything else seemingly looked normal for what it was.
Out of suspicion, they called 911 to report the strange sightings and hopefully have the police come and investigate the home just to make sure the family was safe.
No, he called the police once he saw the blood in the door ajar, and this came directly from the neighbor. The neighbor called the police, and they said they'd send a deputy out, and he said specifically to them, "You better send more than one."
At this point, it was just a simple wellness check to make sure that the family had made it home safe from the barbecue and check in to make sure they were doing okay. When police arrived, the situation would escalate quickly. Inside the house, they found 2 bodies in the kitchen. Brenda and Slade were both lying on the floor, covered in blood, with no vital signs to show they were alive. After further investigation, Mark's body was found in the living room in a very similar condition.
Okay, let me explain to you how they were found exactly too. In fact, there is another one that we will get into. All 3 bodies were found lined up. So Slade was face down with his hands tied with duct tape behind his back. He had been bludgeoned to death with what they later determined to be a framing hammer. His head was at Brenda's feet. So they were laid, head to feet. So her feet were right at the top of his head. She too was bound, but she was bound with duct tape and zip ties, her ankles and her hands. And then Mark, same thing, was laid into the living room area, but almost the same identical way of his feet at her head. They were laying in a line. There was blood smeared throughout the entire house, which later we will find out too was determined to be all of that of Slade, the 13-year-old child. And that is how they knew that the kid's blood was not on the site. So they were hopeful at that point in time that the kids were, still alive and that they were just taken, because when they found out that none of the blood was the children's, the 2 youngest, they were like, okay, where are they?
All 3 victims were tied up and apparently bludgeoned to death, but the 2 younger children, Dylan and Shasta, were gone. If they weren't in the house, the neighbors or the police had no idea where they would be. Even after searching the rest of the house, Dylan and Shasta weren't found, complicating the crime even more. In an effort to preserve what was obviously a crime scene, local authorities sealed off the house and closed down the roads leading to it. There was a search effort launched locally for the 2 children, with neighbors and friends partaking to hopefully bring them home safe. Volunteers from the Kootenai County Search and Rescue were searching through the wooded areas surrounding the house and also the bigger city nearby, Coeur d'Alene.
They were extremely hopeful that they would find the kids in the woods around them. Again, 400 acres of vast wilderness right off the interstate, off of I-90. There's a little frontage road that you can get off one of the exits if you miss it. Well, if you blink, you're going to miss it. But you get off that one exit to Wolf Lodge. That's the only in and out of there. But a lot of wilderness area. They were so hopeful that the kids during the crime had taken off into the woods and that they were hiding in fear or something in the woods. Again, they were not found in the woods right around the location.
For the rest of the day, they searched the areas wondering if Dylan and Shasta had run out of the house when whatever happened took place. But when the initial investigation brought up no immediate results, investigators switched their plan to looking for a kidnapper, believing whoever committed the 3 murders had likely taken Dylan and Shasta with them.
Yep.
An Amber Alert was issued nationwide, hoping that if whoever had the children had managed to get far away already, they would get caught in the act before they could cross any borders that would make them even harder to find.
Let me say something about this too. This was back in 2005. Their faces were on every billboard on the interstate and every place. They did such a good job of keeping those children's faces in the media. They absolutely, I will never forget it. They 100%, they had billboards, Amber Alerts going out. It was from I was living in Montana. It was everywhere. You could not, there was no way you wouldn't know that this was going on because it was everywhere. They did a great job of getting their faces out there. And that's actually what ended up saving this, or saving Shasta.
If not impossible. The case was quiet for a few days with no new leads surfacing and investigators unsure of what to do next. On the surface, neither Brenda nor Mark had any enemies that would have taken such drastic measures, and all the neighbors and immediate family members were cleared as suspects.
That took a while, though, and that is one thing that people need to understand. They highly investigated the father of the children, Steve, which is Brenda's ex-husband, because he had done a press conference early on begging for help. And in the press conference, he said something to law enforcement, or in his plea, he said they had nothing to do with this. Please let them go. And that made investigators think that Steve knew more than what he was saying. And Steve has affiliations with biker organizations. Therefore, they thought maybe it was a hammer killing, which I guess is something consistent with some biker organizations. So they had investigated him thoroughly. Steve actually failed his first polygraph examination, and he was listed, as a suspect or potential suspect. And then one of their friends who was at the barbecue on May 15th, the night before, actually had loaned some money from Brenda, $1,000, to keep his house from going into foreclosure. And the oldest son of Brenda's, who was living with their dad, mentioned to investigators that there was money, involved. And so he too was on their radar. In fact, the friend of theirs, he had left town. He was on probation. He had left town to go to a funeral. His aunt had passed away in California, and he had gone to the funeral. Told his PO he was going to go to find him. Finally, they put it out. Are we back? Everybody's probably gone now. Did we come back? I don't know if we came back or not. My internet is gone. Yeah, something's going on. I don't know what happened. It kicked me out completely. I don't even know if I'm going to be able to come back or not. I tried to link to my hotspot. For some reason, I've got this internet thing going on. It says, we've detected a network performance issue in your area. We're working to make improvements as quickly as we can. You may experience a temporary Xfinity service interruption during this time. We'll have you back up and running. Okay, we're still there. Okay, let me see if I can do it. I don't know if it's going to let me continue or not. We'll try it. It might not have enough juice to run all of this. Sorry, y'all. Sorry. All right, let me go back. Sorry. I don't know why that happened. Why can't they schedule those? Can they not schedule out the outings? That would be really nice. I mean, that would be wonderful. Okay, let me get back to where we were. Sorry. All right. Hold on. Sorry about that, y'all. Tech issues. I figured it out, though. Okay, back to it. Here we go.
Station and spoke with the FBI and investigators, clearing his name from the search very quickly. He told investigators where he was that day, and after proving he could not have been at the house at the time of the murders, he was removed as a possible suspect. Although this was good news for Concrete Bob, there was still someone on the loose that was involved in the joint murder and kidnap.
There was a lot more to that whole Bob story, too, of what Bob had to go through. He absolutely did a polygraph. He actually turned himself in. And he even says in an interview with other news organizations that he had drank himself into a stupor. He should have went in instantaneously and talked to investigators no matter how drunk he was, but he was hurting and he didn't know how to deal with it. And he should have, but at that time he didn't. And therefore they definitely looked at him. Oh, we got snow last night here in Utah. I'm done with the snow.
Shortly after, the suspect list was back down to 0, and the FBI joined the investigation to start combing the entire U.S. for clues since they had no idea where the 2 children had disappeared to. The kidnappings had turned into a national investigation that required much more force.
I just read it, sis. There's an internet. We detected a network performance issue. You could walk upstairs instead of being downstairs. Forgotten. You want to know what's funny, though? Is every time it goes out, I'm like, did I pay the bill? Every time. I don't know why I will always do that. Every time I'm like, oh, did I forget that one? No.
Worse than local authorities. Investigators were offering a $100,000 reward for any information leading to the safe recovery of the 2 children, and they were really hoping that this would bring them home safe. Over the span of only a few days, this quickly became the largest criminal investigation in the history of Kootenai County, with insurmountable amounts of money and resources spent on trying to locate Dylan and Shasta. On May 19th, investigators finally received a tip that they hoped would begin to point them in the right direction. The owner of a sporting goods store in Bonners Ferry, Idaho, called in speaking about a man who was asking for directions to Libby, Montana on the day of the murder. According to the store owner, he drove a white van with Washington license plates, and he had 2 children with him who matched the descriptions of both Dylan and Shasta.
So Bonners Ferry, for those of you guys that don't know, again, very small location, northern Idaho, even further north than Coeur d'Alene. So you go up 95 into Bonners Ferry, which heads to the Canadian border. My brother used to live in Bonners Ferry. It's a tiny little area too. And then you can cut across from like Bonners Ferry into Troy, which is Montana across the border. And you can go in like to Libby that way. So quite a ways north, probably an hour and a half north of the actual location where this took place.
The store owner also noted that while they were in the store together, it seemed as if nothing was wrong, and it didn't occur to him until after that these may have been the children that he had seen on the news. After receiving the tip, all roads leading from Idaho to Montana were thoroughly searched and completely blocked off, but no van or other evidence was found to show police they were looking in the right place. At this point in the investigation, police were trying to think of possible motives that might lead them to their key suspect. Although they had originally found no enemies or hidden secrets of Brenda or Mark, they started to think of other reasons someone might have wanted to hurt their family, reasons they had missed before. Their main motive to go off of at the moment was that a drug deal went
Really, Dumpy Dump? My mom was married to the guy that used to haul mail from Troy to Libby. My mom lived in Troy for quite some time.
wrong, since Brendan and Mark were both found with cannabis and methamphetamines in their system during their autopsies. If Brenda and Mark were buying drugs from someone they potentially owed money to, it might lead investigators in the direction of who would have had a reason to attack the family that day. Local investigators also brought in a gang unit from Spokane, Washington to assist them with their interrogations, thinking this might be gang-related crime. But this motive didn't seem to fit anything, and no new evidence came up. With no new information surfacing after they attempted to trace this lead, they were back to square one, with no idea who the culprit was. The police suddenly came into new information on July 2nd, after two men smoking outside a Denny's diner in Coeur d'Alene recognized Shasta from a billboard they had driven past earlier that day. They alerted the manager. The manager took a quick look at Joseph and Shasta, comparing it to the photos in the missing persons case, and agreed they had found him.
By the way, that Denny's is still in existence, still looks the same, has good food. It's one of the very few places around there that you can actually eat late in the evening. But Denny's is absolutely open all hours of the night. People go there after the bar, so on and so forth. So for them to see a young child at 1 o'clock, past 1 o'clock in the morning, is not normal. Yeah, Liz, I don't know what's going on, but you don't need to stop speaking your opinion. You can talk all you want. You're doing fine. Everybody's fine. But it would be really rare to see a child 1 o'clock in the morning, head to toe, filth. It's a remote area, but that's still not typical. And drug use in that area is rampant. It's very, very rampant.
The manager immediately called 911, and patrons in the diner had positioned themselves surrounding all the exits.
Not only that, but the manager actually went over and engaged. So the manager decided to go over and get a closer look. So she walked over, gave them menus. She actually was standing trying to talk to Shasta, asking if she wanted anything. Shasta would not look up, would not address her. And then she finally asked if she wanted something to drink. And then it was allowed for her. He was fixated on her. Joseph Edward Duncan was sitting across from her, and he had complete control over her. Finally, when she was asked, he allowed her to ask for a chocolate shake. Once she looked up, the manager absolutely said, "This is 100%. Ran over, got on the phone, called 911 and said, "Look, we have Shasta here in Denny's." So he had left Coeur d'Alene 40 days. He had left Coeur d'Alene and came back to the area with the very child that he had taken, but only one. Remember, he had Dylan and Shasta both. So Shasta was the only one present at the restaurant.
But just subtly enough that Joseph wouldn't suspect anything. If he tried to make an escape before the authorities arrived, they would be able to stop him. Joseph then got up and brought Shasta into the bathroom, and when he returned only minutes later, police were inside waiting for him. Shasta was rescued and brought to a nearby hospital for inspection as Joseph was apprehended. Shasta appeared to be in good health and was found with no major injuries. Police then moved on to the red Jeep found in the Denny's parking lot. Inside they found gloves, night vision goggles, a video camera.
By the way, I'm almost positive that this is not the red Jeep that he had. I don't think this is an accurate picture of the Jeep. I'm almost positive it was an older Jeep model than this one, and more of a like fire engine red in color. I will try to get the real one, because this is not the Jeep I ever remember. I could be wrong, but I don't think so.
Camcorder, a 12-gauge shotgun, and a single shotgun shell. The only upsetting part of the discovery was that Dylan was nowhere to be found, even though his sister was still alive and well with Joseph when they were spotted. The local investigators had little hope of finding him alive, but pushed forward with the investigation, hoping they would solve this horrible case on a high note. They reached out to the public and asked for tips or information involving the stolen Jeep Grand Cherokee with Missouri license plate. This is when police uncovered that he had rented the car all the way out in Minnesota but never returned it to the rental location. A new tip broke the ice when a gas station employee called in with more vital information. A woman from Kellogg, Idaho, which is about 40 miles east of Coeur d'Alene, recognized the stolen vehicle as one that had stopped at her station just hours before the arrest ultimately took place.
One thing important about that too, Kellogg is in between. So Kellogg is between Coeur d'Alene and the Montana border. It's on the Idaho side still. It is what's called the Silver Valley. It is absolutely small area too. People notice things but a lot of travel because of the interstate there. There's just a lot that was going on throughout this whole entire time.
She said she even believed that the little girl she saw him with was Shasta, but that it was only the two of them who she remembered seeing. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary about the pair, so she didn't think anything was off. She and one of her coworkers finally called the authorities after reviewing the security tapes and verifying that it actually was Joseph and Shasta in the station that day. Now, investigators knew where Joseph had traveled from and had a better idea of how long he had been without Dylan, helping them identify where they needed to continue looking for him. In order to continue on with the search, the police needed to speak to their main witness, Shasta. She was able to provide the most groundbreaking information once she was cleared from the hospital and able to speak to the FBI. Most of what investigators
She was 8, y'all. She was 8.
know about Dylan and Shasta's disappearance come from Shasta's own statement. This is her direct recollection of the events. On the day of her disappearance, Shasta was woken up by her mother frantically coming into her room and
Trigger warning.
telling her to wake up. Shasta specifically remembered her mother telling her someone was in the house and then went to wake up and alert Dylan as well. Her mother told them both to go quietly and sit in the living room, where they found Joseph waiting with a gun and wearing black gloves, surrounded by the rest of their family members. In front of everyone, Joseph tied Shasta's mother up with nylon zip ties and then proceeded to do the same to her mother's boyfriend, Mark, and her oldest brother, Slade. Shasta and Dylan were both instructed to go outside and stay on the lawn, which they did due to Joseph's threats. Outside, both children could hear screams and thuds coming from inside but were too frightened to go inside or attempt to run away. Then, Shasta saw Slade wander out the front door injured and limping before Joseph came back outside and began beating him. Both parents were bludgeoned to death inside, but neither Dylan nor Shasta were present for it.
So, unfortunately, the 13-year-old during the attack had gotten outside, had wandered outside. They saw Joseph come back, start beating him again, and then he ends up taking him back inside the home, the 13-year-old. So the 8 and 9-year-old Dylan and Shasta were in the vehicle watching and hearing this go down from the outside of the home. The 13-year-old brother. I can't even imagine. And Shasta has had to live with this her entire life, which we're going to get into that too eventually, but it's a lot. This is a horrible story. And to think about, we already know that he had 13 victims by the time he was 17 and he was released time and time and time again. Oh, and it gets worse, y'all. It gets way worse.
Shasta saw Slade being dragged back into the house by Joseph and heard him slump onto the ground. Then Joseph forced Shasta and Dylan into the back of his car and drove off, taking the children through a long drive on dark streets they couldn't recognize. After being taken from their home, Dylan and Shasta were moved to other locations where they were molested and tortured for weeks on end. Shasta could remember that they had driven a very long distance and stayed at 2 different campsites deep in the forest with little food and water for all of them. During this time, Joseph explained to her in depth that he had beaten and killed her family with a hammer, telling her she would never see them again. One day, while at one of the campsites Joseph kept them at, Shasta was sitting beside Joseph's car when she heard a bang come from the other side. She ran to where the sound came from and saw Dylan lying on the ground, screaming out in pain. She could see he was bleeding from his side, but she couldn't see why. Joseph was apparently looking for a beer and a tub of ice when his shotgun went off, shooting Dylan in the meantime. Shasta then saw Joseph walk over to Dylan, pull out his shotgun, and pull the trigger, while aiming directly at his head.
All right, we're going to take a break for a second. I remember this like it was yesterday. This case imprinted in my head because I was a young mom. I had a 3-year-old daughter at the time. I was living in Stevensville, Montana. He was found not super far from that area. It was on every billboard, every sign, every TV you turned on, everywhere. This story was everywhere, and nobody knew about the horror that he had done to these kids until this little 8-year-old girl, bravely enough, told her entire story, and this was her recount. Oh, Nikki, this is terrible. It gets worse. We're not even done yet. We're not even done yet. Like, this case is absolutely horrific. And to think this piece of shit, by the way, this piece of shit ended up dying of, cancer, I think it was, or something to do with that, medical issues on death row. He didn't even get put to death. Absolutely horrific piece of shit. But think about how many of them. He's from, he lived in Tacoma for a long time. Think about the Green River Killer, Jeffrey Dahmer. All of those guys had ties to the Pacific Northwest too. I don't know what it is, but I'm telling you, and they were all overlapping. There was these poor kids. Yeah, Nikki, 100%. And I hate to say that, but he was something else.
Only the shotgun didn't fire. While Dylan begged Joseph not to kill him, Joseph reloaded the shotgun and shot him in the head, killing him instantly. Joseph immediately started crying, begging Shasta to believe that he didn't mean to kill him. While the first gunshot was just an accident, Joseph felt like he needed to put him out of his misery and ended Dylan's life out of sympathy. From here on, Shasta...
9 years old, he ended his life out of sympathy. You think he ended his life out of sympathy? No, he didn't want to take him for medical treatment. Piece of absolute shit. He refused to get a medical treatment because he accidentally shot him. And then he just...
Shasta knew she would be alone with Joseph, and she didn't know if that meant life or death for her. She watched her own brother die, and then Joseph left to dispose of his body before he told her to get in the car and took her to their next spot. Only a couple days after watching her own brother be killed by her captor, Shasta faced her own horrendous situation. During a confusing situation where Joseph had no idea what to do with Shasta anymore, he gave her the option to choose her own way of death. He felt he couldn't keep her anymore, and they were facing too many close calls that almost got him caught. Joseph told Shasta to choose either being strangled or shot. Shasta chose a gunshot, knowing it would be the faster, less painful way of dying.
8-year-old just watched her 9-year-old brother get shot in the head and killed. Watched her 13-year-old brother and her mother, heard it, didn't saw the brother, heard the screams of her mom's boyfriend, her mother, and saw her 13-year-old running out of the house, getting bludgeoned to death, drugged back into the house. Then she watches her 9-year-old brother get shot in the head. And then this piece of shit tells this 8-year-old girl, pick which way you want to die. 8 years old.
At this point, at 8 years old, the girl had almost accepted that she was going to die. But suddenly, Joseph grabbed her from behind, putting a rope behind her neck and pulling it tighter and tighter. Shasta begged for him to stop, but he wouldn't budge. Joseph kept tightening the rope until Shasta said something that caught him off guard. She called him by his nickname, Jay, which he had told her and her brother about once or twice. This last-minute attempt worked, and Joseph loosened his grip, finally letting her take the gasp of air that saved her life. Joseph looked at Shasta in a way she had never seen him look at her before. With tears in her eyes, Joseph asked Shasta if she would like to go on a trip to meet his mother. Shasta agreed, believing she had no other option, and the two drove back towards Coeur d'Alene. On their way to meet Joseph's mother, they stopped at Denny's. the same Denny's diner where Shasta would finally be recognized and rescued. Joseph was finally arrested for the kidnapping of 8-year-old Shasta and the murder of 9-year-old Dylan on July 2, 2005. He was also charged with the murders of Shasta's mother, her mother's boyfriend, and her oldest brother. For the next few days, the search party for Dylan continued, but Shasta had already come forward to explain the death of her own brother. On July 4th, investigators found human remains at a makeshift campsite located in the Lolo National Forest near Regis, Montana.
So St. Regis is a little hole in the wall. Again, there's really nothing there. There's maybe 2 services in the entire area. It's gorgeous. Very, very beautiful. Lolo National Forest, gorgeous area, very remote though. And that's where he had been taken, and they had lived in the forest in all these remote locations over the 40 days that he had the kids. And that's where he ended up killing Dylan, and Dylan's remains were found.
The remains were collected as evidence and sent to the FBI lab in Quantico, Virginia, to be tested for DNA or other identifying factors. The remains were positively identified as those of Dylan, confirming Shasta's recollection of his murder. Joseph was sent to trial for all 4 murders and the kidnapping of Shasta. During the investigation, it was discovered that Dylan was killed by a sawed-off shotgun at point-blank range. Although Joseph was now in prison awaiting trial, the investigation into his crimes didn't stop there. Investigators also found evidence linking Joseph to the murder of Anthony Martinez, a boy from California.
I don't know if many of you know about Anthony Martinez, but it was only because of this story that they were able to finally link, and he stood trial for that case too, which we're going to get into more in depthly. I just wanted you guys to have some groundwork of where we're headed in this story and the overview of the major pieces of it before we dive deeper into it. And I'm sorry, it's very triggering. This is a very, very disturbing story.
On April 4th, 1997, 10-year-old Anthony was playing with his friends in the front yard of his house as he usually did. When an unknown man approached the group, the kids thought nothing of him. Anthony and his friends lived in a relatively safe neighborhood and were not scared of being outside alone. The man asked them about his missing cat, hoping they could help him find it. But when the boys refused to help him search, the man grabbed Anthony at knife point and threw him into the back of his vehicle, with all of his friends as witnesses. After 2 weeks of nonstop searching by family, friends, and police.
Can you imagine the friends? Can you imagine his friends that stood there and watched this guy take him too? Like the horror of all of this. He had no concern for anybody else. Broad daylight with others around. This man should have never been released to begin with. Ever. 13 horrific crimes by the time he was 17. Served 14 years of a 20-year sentence. Was out to reoffend. And let the whole Shasta piece of it, Shasta is the lone survivor of his. And the ripple effect that this has had in her life, you can only imagine the survivor's guilt, which we're going to get into a little bit more. She is a fighter, and I don't know how she does it, but I've heard different interviews with her that some days she wishes it would have been her because of all of the guilt, for surviving, and then the trauma and the horror of all of this. Like, she was a young girl. She was 8 years old.
Anthony's body was found nude and partially decomposed in Indio, California on April 19th. Investigators noted that he had been sexually assaulted and bound with duct tape, but no key suspects were noted at the time.
Duct tape again. Interesting, huh? That was like one of his signatures, is the duct tape. The duct tape absolutely was something that ended up, they found out in all of his cases, that was a thing. Angel, that's the thing. I think any of us that lived around that location will never forget this, because that is one thing I will say. The media did an absolute incredible job. Law enforcement and the media in that area kept these kids' faces in the news at all times. You couldn't go anywhere, anything, without seeing missing flyers for these children. And it was because of that she ended up being rescued, because she was recognized. Most people would have just, yes, it stood out that she was filthy from head to toe 1 o'clock in the morning at Denny's with a random man. But that would have never sent off the red flags like all of the flyers, you know, the travelers that saw. Thank goodness for them. Thank goodness. In fact, one of my really good friends, her dad worked this case. He's an ISP lieutenant. He's passed away now. He died of COVID 2 years ago, but he worked this case and was close with the entire family. And hearing it from their perspective and what, oh God, yeah, there's a whole way. I wish he was still with us today so he could tell the story, because he would absolutely came on and talked about it. Horrifying though. Absolute horrifying. The law enforcement agencies that worked this case will never forget either.
They continued the investigation and created a composite hand-drawn sketch of what the perpetrator was assumed to look like based on the other witnesses' recollection, but no leads came through. Partial fingerprints were also taken from the duct tape found attached to Anthony's body, but without...
This is the guy I also have said when the Idaho 4 case came out, and I said, this reminds me of Joseph Edward Duncan, and I showed his picture. Brian Kohberger, looks-wise, looks more like this sick son of a bitch than anybody else that I've seen. Just that smirk, I think it is.
Without anything to compare them to, they led nowhere. Eventually, the case went cold. In July of 2005, online bloggers tied Joseph to the case of murdered Anthony. The composite sketch matched his appearance at the time, and the vehicle the perpetrator was driving in Anthony's case was also a match to a car that Joseph had owned. After finding this lead, the FBI and National Center for Missing and Exploited Children became involved once again and contacted the required local authorities. They were then able to match Joseph's fingerprints to those found in Anthony's case.
It took bloggers after this case broke. They were able to help connect him to the Anthony Martinez murder. Think about that. So again, 2005, climate was a lot different with YouTube, things of that nature, but armchair detectives, internet sleuths did provide handy in this situation. I will always say that, like, there is a time and place for people, but at the same time, this son of a bitch should have never been out to begin with. He should have never been able to do this to these kids or adults.
Finally confessed on video on July 19th, 2005. He went as far as describing the crime as...
We're actually going to, in the next part where, well, I think it's the third part that I've laid it out. The third part, we are going to listen to his entire confession, and that is chilling to the core. So be prepared for that coming up. But this son of a bitch, that smirk, the little crooked nose, like, this is who I kept saying. This reminds me of that Kohberger guy. The younger pictures of him, and in fact, their education levels, very similar. A lot of, yeah, there's a lot.
As, quote, revenge against society for sending him back to jail for a probation violation. In August of 2005, Joseph admitted to other crimes that would catch the attention of investigators. On July 6, 1996, while on parole following one of his previous crimes, Joseph killed 2 girls from Seattle. Both sisters, 11-year-old Sammy Jo White and 9-year-old Carmen Cubius, disappeared after leaving the Crest Motel on Aurora Avenue North in Seattle to beg for food. About 2 years later, on February 10th,
Think about that. These 2 young girls left their hotel to beg for food. Think about that. And this son of a bitch is the one. Yeah, Susan, 100% Bundy. Yeah. Oh, did I say Dahmer earlier? I meant Bundy. I don't. It was Bundy. That was. I just. Yeah. Like, this is a hard one to get through. I've been wanting to talk about this for so long, but he should have never been able to. Think about how many in his entire, what he admits to. Oof.
1998, the girls' remains were found by a passerby in an abandoned barn in Bothell. The King County Medical Examiner's Office declared that their death likely occurred soon after they went missing, meaning their remains had been hidden inside the barn for years. Joseph confessed to beating them both to death after finding them on the streets. Joseph was convicted in a total of 3 courts. He was charged by an Idaho district court for the kidnapping and murders of Brenda, Slade, and Mark, by the United States District Court for the kidnapping of Shasta and Dylan and the murder of Dylan, and by a California Superior Court for the kidnap and murder of Anthony. Joseph's first appearance at the Kootenai County Court in Idaho was on July 13, 2005. He was charged with 3 counts of first-degree murder and 3 counts of first-degree kidnapping in the case of Brenda, Slade, and Mark. County prosecutors had initially planned to charge him with the kidnappings of both Shasta and Dylan. However, these charges were deferred to the federal courts as he transported the children across state lines for the purpose of sexual exploitation.
That's how they got him on federal. So that's talked about a lot in a lot of these cases of what distinguishes federal versus state crimes, so on and so forth. Well, his were federal because he was crossing state lines to commit more crimes. So he was able to be charged in both.
His trial in Kootenai County was set to begin on January 17, 2006, but it was delayed until April 4th after the district judge granted the defense's request to have more time to prepare for trial. The trial actually began in October, after the judge granted everybody additional time to prepare so that nobody would have to do the trial twice. Joseph's attorney specifically blamed the multiple postponements on the prosecutor's insistence on pursuing the death penalty and hence needing additional time to collect evidence. On October 16, 2006, just after the official jury selection began, prosecutors and Joseph's attorney reached a plea bargain where Joseph would plead guilty to all of the state charges being pressed against him. He was then immediately sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole. However, the sentencing of his 3 murder charges was pending based on the outcome of his federal trial. The judge declared that if he did not receive the death penalty at the federal trial, then he would have to return to Kootenai County Court for another case to decide if he should receive the death penalty there. Over 3 years later, after his federal charges were already complete, Joseph was sentenced to an additional 3 life sentences by Kootenai County Court. As part of the investigation, Joseph also agreed to cooperate with investigators and give them passwords leading to his encrypted files on his computer.
Think about that. Think about the Koberger case currently. Think about how things have laid out. That's a death penalty case too. Think about... Did you just turn the TV on? Chloe, get off the remote. My dog's on the remote. Think about all this. Like, this is just... Anna, he ended up dying on death row of medical conditions. Yeah, he ended up passing away of natural causes, basically. Well, not natural causes, medical issues, but...
On January 18, 2007, Joseph was then indicted by a federal grand jury on 10 counts of kidnapping, kidnapping resulting in death, aggravated sexual abuse of a minor, and sexual exploitation of a child resulting in death.
And he should have never been out to do that again. He should have never gotten out to do that again to begin with. This man, again, if you're just coming in, this man admitted to having 13 crimes, raping children, young as kids in a diaper, by the time he was 17. He spent 14 years in prison and then had one arrest after another, more and more and more. And ultimately, he was on bond when he killed this family. He was on bond out of North Dakota when he killed this family.
He also faced charges related to other crimes like illegal firearms possession and vehicle theft. This trial also had postponements, and on December 3, 2007, Joseph pled guilty to all 10 charges being placed against him. One condition of the agreement was that Shasta would not have to testify in the trial, but other agreements of the plea deal were not released due to a gag order. During the jury selection of his sentencing trial, however, Joseph dismissed his attorneys and chose to represent himself exclusively. His attorneys tried to...
Who does that sound like, that they think they're smarter than their own attorneys? That he was going to represent himself? Think about that. I think it was too. I can't remember what kind of cancer. I have it in my stuff. I've done so much research on this case, but some of it gets jumbled up because I'm like, okay, this goes in section 1. This goes in section 2. It is. We'll get to the end of it. And I'm positive it's cancer, but I can't remember what kind. But yeah, he died. He died on death row. Didn't get the death penalty, of course. Oh, he's creepy as fuck. Yeah. Yep. It was brain cancer. Okay. I thought so.
Reject this, saying to the court that he was not competent enough to do so, and they requested a formal hearing on the issue.
Oh, he didn't.
A district court ordered an evaluation to determine Joseph's level of confidence, and accepted the evaluator's conclusion that he was in fact competent enough to proceed without counsel, and accepted the evaluator's conclusion that he was in fact competent enough to proceed without counsel and continue as his own attorney. On August 27, 2008, after many hours of deliberation, the jury finally recommended the death penalty, and the judge shortly after imposed 3 death sentences for kidnapping, sexual exploitation of a child, and use of a firearm in a violent crime. All of these charges were directly related to Dylan Groen. On November 3rd of that year, Joseph was sentenced to an additional 3 consecutive life terms without parole for the kidnapping and sexual abuse of Shasta. After this, Joseph's standby counsel filed an appeal, but Joseph wrote to the court informing them that this was granted against his wishes. A federal judge ruled that he was mentally competent, and when he decided to represent himself, he gave up his right to appeal his death sentence. Psychiatrists working with the prosecution diagnosed Joseph with pedophilia, sadistic personality disorder, antisocial personality disorder, and narcissistic tendencies.
On top of, they called him a sexual psychopath when he was a child. So as a child, he was diagnosed with antisocial personality disorder and a sexual psychopath. Now they've added on the rest of those too.
However, even with all of these diagnoses, he was still found to be legally sane and responsible for his actions. On January 18, 2007, the same day Joseph was indicted in federal court, officials from Riverside County announced that he was being charged with Anthony Martinez's murder. However, he was not extradited to California until January of 2009, 5 months after being sentenced to death by a federal court. Joseph again pleaded guilty, taking responsibility for Anthony's murder on March 15, 2011, and in April was sentenced to 2 more life terms in prison. As part of the plea deal, he removed his right to the possibility of parole or appeal, although Joseph could have faced an entirely separate death sentence. In relation to Anthony's case, this was waived by a district attorney after stating that he had consulted with Anthony's family, who wanted closure in the case, and that the federal prison would ultimately take his life before California would. Prior to his arrest, Joseph also maintained a personal website titled The Fifth Nail. The inspiration from this is apparently based on the 4 nails used to pierce the body of Jesus Christ during his crucifixion, and that a 5th nail was taken away and hidden by the Romans. This gory website depicted Joseph's day-to-day life as a convicted sex offender. He publicly denied being a pedophile despite raping and molesting multiple children throughout his life. He also claimed to have been sexually abused as a child. He continued posting online after being imprisoned, where he would share content under the name Silenced. He also posted letters.
Can you believe that sick shit? He was allowed to post after he was in prison. He was allowed to post and continue this on. Hey, Midnight Radio. This story just boils my blood. There is nothing about this story that doesn't boil my blood.
From himself on his own behalf. Most public defenders from Kootenai County declined the possibility that Joseph could have been blogging from his prison. After all, inmates didn't have access to the internet.
Yeah, okay. That's why my sister had a tablet from, oh my God, these people. Look at his fan mail that he was getting. Yes, they say he wasn't, but he absolutely was. He absolutely was. They said that there was no way, but you can get devices actually in the prison that you can get a whole device just for the internet. Yep. They still say he wasn't, but there's confirmation of it.
Any and all outgoing letters are scanned for contraband, although they're not read word for word. Most people who read this blog did believe that it was Joseph posting from inside his jail cell. It's something we'll never know for sure. In March of 2021, Joseph was announced to have a chronic health condition. He had been diagnosed about 6 months prior with glioblastoma, a rapidly growing, aggressive, malignant brain tumor. He had
That's exactly what it was. They always use the term, but he died of brain cancer. Yeah. So they say that there's no way we'll ever know because he's passed away. But people who have experts in all of this stuff going through it said that's 100% him. That's exactly how it's consistent with the blog. Again, he was posting under the screen name Silenced. Oh yeah. They get all sorts of stuff in jail. Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely, Lindsay. They know how to use those things. Let me tell you, there's a whole thing. You buy the tablets, it's a mess.
Stage 4 brain cancer. Joseph was offered treatment but refused both chemotherapy and radiation. He died on March 28, 2021. He was 58 years old. Joseph Edward Duncan was a depraved person who couldn't stop himself from harming people, especially children. He wanted to blame child abuse for his evil deeds, but even if those claims are true, it doesn't excuse his actions. He still chose a path that led to him becoming a horrible monster. If you're the victim of domestic abuse, please reach out to someone for help. Please talk to your local shelter or call the National Domestic Abuse Hotline at 1-800-799-SAFE. That's 1-800-799-7233. Or you can go to thehotline.org to chat with someone online. This website is set up so that at any time, hitting the escape key twice will take you to a Google search page. That way, if your abuser is nearby, you won't get caught seeking help. If you're having feelings of harming yourself or someone else, or even just need someone to talk to, please contact your local mental health facility, call 911, or call the National Suicide Prevention Hotline by simply dialing 988 in the United States. They're available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and will talk to you about any mental health issue you may be facing. Thanks so much for letting me tell you this story. If you enjoyed it, subscribe on whatever platform you're on.
All right. That was another good one from that. This story is so bad. So This is Monsters. That's the stream that this is from. But we're going to go into more of it in the next couple ones. We're not going to do more today because that's a lot. Let's talk about it though. Let's talk about what we just watched. What pieces you guys are like blown away by. Again, a lot of you had never heard of this story before. Yes. The 988. I don't know about the other one. I'm not really sure about that one. I'm not sure all the numbers are still the right. We don't have the death penalty in Canada. 1988 abolished the. Oh, really? I didn't even know that. See, I stand not usually for the death penalty, but situations like this, I absolutely believe but then again, a lot of other people that sit on death row sit there forever. Yeah, the fact that he kept, yes, right? Hey, Gina, thank you. Yeah, absolutely. It's just so sickening. Like this story itself. Let me see. I have a couple more short ones that we can do today. I guess that I could throw in here with this. Hold on. We can do a few of these. We're going to actually walk back in part 2 and talk about more in depth of these crimes because that's kind of an overview. But let me grab new attorney testimony takes center stage. Oh, Shasta has wrote a book on her experience. Hold on. Let me grab this. Oh, hold on. Let me grab it. Got to share my screen. Hold on. This is a story that just, this poor young lady. She's a young lady now. She's a mom herself, and I can't. Any of his family left. So he had 5 siblings. There was 5 of them total. He had 1 younger brother and 3 older sisters. I think they all are living currently. He was one of 5. I think they're all living. I think his mother has passed away. But I'm not positive on that. I will verify that tomorrow. Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. Yeah. 14 out of 20 years is actually a lot for these days. Like a lot. Let me show you this one.
The most shocking, horrific crimes the Northwest has ever seen. It was 13 years ago, Joseph Duncan murdered a Coeur d'Alene family before kidnapping and torturing two of the family's children.
Now the lone survivor plans to detail what happened in her own words. Shasta Groney was just 8 years old when Duncan kidnapped and raped her. Now 21, she's working on a book of her experiences.
Creme 2's Taylor Vito spoke with a local author Groney is working with, and Taylor joins us live with more now.
Well, guys, Shasta Groney's writing partner tells me that in writing a book on these horrific crimes, she wants others to know that it's possible to overcome terrible situations. She also hopes to make a documentary and send a clear message to Joseph Duncan in the process.
It's horrific. It's beyond horrific.
The tragic story captured headlines for months. Joseph Duncan, a convicted sex offender, murdered Brenda Groney, her boyfriend and son, at their home near Coeur d'Alene. Shasta and her brother Dylan were kidnapped by Duncan and molested. Dylan was eventually murdered.
Ted Bundy had nothing on this Joseph Duncan character. I mean, he is literal monster.
Shasta was rescued after she and Duncan were spotted in town and he was arrested. This is Shasta today, now 21 years old and a mother of two living in southern Idaho. A few years ago, she connected online with local writer Jamie Settlemeyer.
Then we kind of became family a little bit.
Shasta has not had an easy experience with all this either. She absolutely, unfortunately, not shocking, got into drugs. I mean, how would you not, to numb all this? She's had a really rough go of things. She, in fact, her and her children went missing for a short period of time. They were searching for them. She has had a very, very rough go of it since the story. I mean, how could you not? Safari, I agree. I agree with you on that. And it's different for every situation too. Like, that's why it's hard to say you're for or against something because every situation differs. Parole boards are definitely interesting. Yes, for sure.
Amy learned that Shasta was planning on writing a book. Recognizing how strong of a person Shasta is, Settlemeyer offered to help.
She needs to acknowledge it and let the world understand this is what the world can be. But look, you can survive. You can make it through.
So the pair have slowly been piecing together a book of Shasta's experiences. They've launched this online fundraiser in an effort to fund the book and make sure Shasta, instead of some publisher, retains control of the project. Settlemeyer says Shasta also has her eyes on making a documentary, one that will chronicle her journey to visit Duncan in prison and personally deliver him a searing message.
The gist of it is he does not own her. He does not have any control.
Shasta for years tried to block out the horrible memories of what happened. But Settlemeyer says in sharing what happened, Shasta can hopefully empower other victims.
And that's really what she wants you to know is don't feel sorry for me. I am a strong warrior, do understand and have sympathy for people, but we can all be strong warriors.
And online, Shasta has said that she hopes to have the book out by the end of October. Now, I should add that my colleague Whitney Ward has been in touch with Shasta and Jamie as well. Sometime from now, you can expect a much more in-depth story from her while you're here, where you will hear from Shasta herself. In the studio, Taylor.
Yeah. The whole strong warrior thing. How strong can somebody even be? Yeah, she's gorgeous. She's a beautiful young lady. She doesn't live very far from me currently still. She lives closer to Yinzi than she does me, but sorry, Yinzi. I said that out loud, but you say that all the time. I'm like, never mind. Yinzi's already said it. If you only knew, like, we're going to get into some of this. She shouldn't have had to be strong. She was 8 years old. And this should have never even, and sadly, her life has been very, very, we're going to actually hear from her, like there is a lot of interviews that she's done and talks. She's had a very rough go of this because that's what we just watched today is a tiny brief of this man's life and horrors that he did to people. Not only the Groney family, but you have the Martinez family and the two little girls in Seattle. I just can't wrap my head around how this got. Yeah, I know, Yinzi, that's what I'm like. I don't know. I said it out loud, but then I'm like, oh, never mind. Yeah, Liz, I actually had a hard time finding the book. I thought that would be a great read for all of us to read. I'm going to look again and see if I can find it again, but I couldn't find it when let me look on Amazon. I guess I never looked there. I don't think it was on Amazon though. Yeah, it's not on Amazon that I could find, but let me see. There's actually another really good one that we're going to go over. It's called, oh, there's another one about this by Gary King, Stolen in the Night, the true story of a family's murder, a kidnapping, and the child who survived. So Stolen in the Night by Gary C. King. It's an ebook. That's one, but I'm not finding, I can't find the one from that lady. I wonder if they ever finished it. I don't know. I'll look into it. I'll see if I can find it. Yeah, I would love to read her book too. Yeah, that's the only one I can find, Starry Night, is the one by Gary C. Check Indigo and the actual publisher. Safari, I will absolutely do that. I will have answers for you on that tomorrow. So I'm going to look into the book. I've got timeline stuff that we're going to include. We're going to talk about more of his extensive cases. It's bad. We're going to talk about his confession. That's really rough. Really, really rough. Yeah, it's sad. She's gone through so much. Bless her soul. She has been through so freaking much. Survivor's guilt is something else, I tell you what. Yeah, Saucy, I agree with it. Eye for an eye. Eye for an eye. Like, that's why, yeah, he had a brain tumor. Was it miserable? Probably. He refused chemo and radiation. You know, I guess in a way he got the easy way out in the end too, in a way, after bludgeoning them to death with a freaking framing hammer. A framing hammer. They knew it wasn't a murder or like a robbery too, because there was a lot of rifles and guns in the house. It's Northern Idaho. Everybody has guns. So there was a lot of weapons in the house. So they knew instantly that it wasn't like a robbery going in because all of the weapons were still there. However, I don't know if he brought the shotgun with him or if it was one that he did get along the way. Oh, Susan. Yeah, 100%. Thank you for watching with me. This is a story that this was so heavy on my mind during the Brian Koberger stuff because the face of the man, this is why I could never get it out. Cherish, that's what I was just looking for. So the lady that supposedly is helping her, let me tell you her name again. Jamie Settlemeyer. It's S-E-D-L-A or S-E-D-L-M-A-Y-E-R. Jamie, let me put it in the comments. That's her name, but I could not find it. Oh, and I can't type. I need a mouse. I need to decide if I want a trackpad or a mouse. Yeah, there was a Kickstarter for it, but I just never saw. I didn't see there. Yeah. Well, he was fixated on multiple people. So he got night vision stuff, started stalking them, finally all sorts of stuff. Yes. Yes. She has done an interview. She's done interviews. Yep. She spoke out. Yeah. Lisa, that very true. Rachel, to my knowledge, no. To my knowledge, she never got to deliver that message in anything that I've researched, but maybe she has. Again, that the recent history with her is kind of all over the place because it has been really traumatic. Like I said, she went missing throughout this whole thing as an adult. They did a missing persons thing. Like there's been so much with this story. Oh, Saucy, this is a horrible one. That's what we just did. That's the RRR. That's what we just watched. We just watched This Is Monsters. We just did the This Is Monsters. We started out with the layout of his background from another podcaster, and then we did This Is Monsters video on this. Great video. Yeah. Some of it a little iffy on some of the details, but main point, yes. People Magazine. That's the other thing. If you guys are interested in like the docuseries on these, oh, no, you're good. RR. I figured you just came in. There is a People Magazine Investigates on ID Network. It's season 6, episode 1. It's about an hour and a half. Wonderful breakdown, very detailed. We could watch that as a class too, I guess. We could do it together. But that's an excellent overview and probably more detail oriented with the actual facts of this than most I've seen. Yeah, We Are Monsters was great. Very great. And that whoever that podcaster is laying out the background and the timeline, I was really glad about that. Crazy, crazy stuff. I had never heard of This Is Monsters until I just started researching this too. There's some really good podcasters out here on this stuff too. I like some of these channels that I'm finding that do stuff, but they kind of do closed cases more so than active cases too. Yeah. They let this man away every time you turn around. And to think that if they would have never, can you imagine if she would have gotten out of that Denny's? If they wouldn't have seen her in that Denny's? Can you imagine? They would have never known. Never had a clue. Anyways, that's that. That's a lot to process. Watching these is just like, oh. No, yeah, exactly, Susan. That's the thing though. They have been trying to cover this Brian Koberger stuff. No. Sherilyn Dale, True Crime Channel. I'll have to check it out. Nap time. Good. Yeah, he does a really good job, Angel. I was really impressed with this one too. He did a really good job. And of course, there's always like little details that people have, but main piece and those little details are just different reporting sources too of where you get your information from. They all have a different little twist, even mainstream media. So he did an excellent job. Absolutely excellent job. Oh, Marcy, you'll catch it. This is a rough one. Okay, so next time we're going to do the next piece of it and we're going to jump into that and you guys can hear more about him. It's so much. Steve, her dad too. Steve thought, oh God, that was a mess. Steve was having a hard time. The father of Slade, Dylan, and Shasta, the 3 youngest, plus the 2 older children, but he had a hell of a time during this whole Anthony Martinez trial, and he was having a lot of issues with the fact that he thought that that case would hold things up and he would, have more time to screw around and play games with everybody, which is what we see so common. And it took a long time, but this wore on everybody. I can't even imagine how the family is handling. Truth and Justice is an amazing podcast. Wrongful Convictions. Oh, that's great. Yeah, 3 years ago, Steve passed away. Steve had, I don't remember what that's called, where they have to replace the voice box with the little, I can't remember what the technical term for it is, but he had to have one of those too during this whole thing. I don't know if he had throat cancer or not, but this case took a toll. Brenda's poor mom and her siblings. She's one of 4. Brenda was one of 4 siblings, and they've all lived in the Coeur d'Alene area. This took no, it's not a trach. It's the one that you talk with. It's the one that you push the button to talk. I don't remember what is it still just a trach? And they push the button. I don't remember what the actual procedure is called. Anyways, he ended up having one of those. Oh, is it Starry Night? Joanne Conrad? I'll have to look. So there's the one by Gary, but I can't remember the name of it. Yeah. Anyways. Ha! Goodbye. Have a great day. Forgotten. Comments. Ton of comments to get through. You're better than me at that. Oh, shit. Somebody gifted membership. See, I can't see it. Thank you, Safari, for letting me know. Wait. Susan, thank you so much. Let me play the song. Thank you again. Hey, Kimmy. This is just... this story is, ugh. I feel just drained after even listening to this story again. I swear these people I think he got away with so much. Welcome to the Cana, everybody.
Welcome to the jungle. We got fun and games.
All right, y'all. I am going to head on out of here for the afternoon. I'm going to try to get my pre-record done and get it up and posted in a premiere on that. We'll pick up with part 2 of this tomorrow. Yeah, it's really interesting to think of the minds. That's why I want to dig into this a little bit deeper into the background of like him and his childhood and all of the different things that he actually got away with, because there's no reason why he should have ever been let out to begin with. He should have never been out on the street. He was out on fucking bond when he killed this family. He was out on bond, skipped bond. They had placed, he was wanted. Ugh. So frustrating. But then again, like this happens. How often are we finding this out, that these things are happening? Crazy. Thank you so much, y'all, for being here with me today. I know we're kind of taking a little bit of a different step, but we need a break. So that's what we're doing. It's about us over here. It's about all of us in our voice box. Thank you. Yes. So tomorrow we'll talk part 2, get a little bit deeper into this, and I will see you guys later on all the bullshit. Yeah, thank you guys for watching and hanging out with me, transferring to something different. I know it's not all of your guys' thing, but this story to me is extremely important because, I mean, how could it not be? Oh, yeah. Lisa, right? And to think he had victims in California, Washington, all over. He had victims everywhere. Craziness. All right, y'all. Have a great day. I'll see you later.
How do I say goodbye? Glad you came. Closing time. Hit the road, Jack. You don't have to go home, but make the best of this test and don't ask why. But you can't stay.